Hey there, welcome to Warp Surge Radio. I'm Nick from Hexfleet Virulence. Welcome to episode 9, coming to you straight out of the warp, straight out of the Eye of Terror once again. On episode 9, we're going to talk about my first tournament of 9th edition. And it was a Rogue Trader tournament, it was local in the area. And by the way, if you join live in chat, just let me know whether you can hear me. I'm going to be listening and watching the chat on my phone. Just did an audio test, so hopefully everything works great, just like the last couple episodes. But let me know, and feel free to throw your thoughts and comments into the chat. And so I ran a pretty unusual list that I came up with for 9th edition. I'll go through why I built that list the way I did, and I'll go through all of my games. I'll show you the list that all of my opponents used, and I'll give some thoughts at the end about what I learned about the new match play missions and all the changes to 9th edition in general and how that's going to affect competitive play. Hey Samuel, yeah, great to have you. I'm glad that you can hear me and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. And first of all, let's see what I even played. This is my list. I call it the Blightlords Did Nothing Wrong, since it largely revolves around Magnus the Red and a full squad of 10 Blightlords. And you can see in there that I also have 2 Demon Princes of Tzeentch. I actually ripped them apart, magnetized them, and painted them back up because the wings are so expensive now for the extra 35 points. They were still already the same price for 1,000 Suns, but with everything else going up, I just didn't have that in my list easily available to have those spare points, because now I kind of need everything that I can get my hands on. And you could see in there also that I have a third-party model, a special Typhus that I really like, and then I have some Cultists and some Poxwalkers. So let me give you a better close-up shot. Here you can see my Magnus the Blue. His color scheme matches the rest of my Thousand Suns models. And I've did a little bit of conversion work on him. And then I also have in there just my Blightlords, which are 5 from the kit, and then 5 that I kit bashed myself. And you'll see in there they have 2 Flails of Corruption, and then 8 Bubotic Axe and Combi Plasma. But let's actually go through the list itself. And hopefully this is going to work. Let's find out. If I can get this going. There we go. See, this is why you just have to spend a lot of time preparing for these YouTube lives. You wouldn't think so. You'd think the whole point of live is that you don't have to. But my list here, which a lot of people have been asking me about on Facebook, in different Facebook groups, and on Discord in the competitive Death Guard and Thousand Suns channels. Let me tell you what's in the list, and then I'll walk you through why this was the list that I chose to bring to my first tournament in 9th edition. So it starts off, you have this Thousand Suns detachment with Magnus. He's the Warlord. And then you have a Plague Company Patrol that I play the 2 command points for. It was Mortarian's Anvil was my Plague Company. I've got Typhus upgraded for reroll 1s. I've got 3 squads of 19 Poxwalkers each. And then I have a squad of 10 Blightlords that, like I said, have 8 that are Axe and Combi Plasma, 2 that are Flails, and then I have a Foul Blight Spawn. And then I have a Patrol of Thousand Suns, which is free. It's rewarded back in terms of command points because Magnus the Red is my Warlord with the way the new Supreme Command Detachment works. And then I have it's very simple. I have got the minimum that I need to take from troops, which is 10 cultists, and then I have 2 demon princes on foot. And now you have to list your powers ahead of time, and you also have to list your upgrades ahead of time. So one of them has a relic and a warlord trait. The other one just has a relic, and by making them Cult of Magic, they both have +1 to cast. And the other relic that I have is the Helm of Third Eye, which is really the best CP regen relic or mechanism that Chaos has access to, because every time your opponent uses a command point, you gain a command point back on yourself. Or if they use a stratagem, each time you just roll, and on a 5 or a 6, not just on a 6, like a lot of things, you get a command point. And now that your opponent is guaranteed to always have at least one command point to use on stratagems every round, now that you get one per round, it's a lot more likely that it'll kick in rather than your opponent burning out of all of his or her command points in the first 1 or 2 rounds. And so that actually came in very handy, and I'll talk about that during my matches. But to recap, why did I pick this? At a high level, this Blightlords Did Nothing Wrong list is based around a couple of changes that came with 9th edition. One of them is now I can reserve Magnus. It cost me 3 command points, and if I wanted, I could also reserve something else to outflank, because he's like 24 power level, and 3 command points gets you up to 29 power level. However, I can't do that in this list because I also deep strike the Blightlords. And Magnus is now 465 points. The Blightlords are 500. Just like in 8th edition, you're only allowed to reserve half of your points. And so I can't fit anything else in there. But I can reserve and leave off the table turn 1 Magnus and a full squad of Blightlords. And so outflanking him means that, yes, I can bring him in on the side or something and then choose what I smite at. That's really hit or miss, but the main thing is that I can bring him on outside of denial range if I really need to, and then have the 2 Demon Princess cast the survivability powers on him for +1 to the vulnerable save and -1 to hit. And there's nothing the opponent can do at that point to stop it if I come out of deny range, or they don't have any denials, and then he just comes straight on the board. They have 0 opportunity to shoot at him before I cast the survivability powers on him, which is a huge change to 8th edition, where he's just this expensive thing that if you went second, he almost automatically died, because it's so much easier to kill him when he doesn't have those 2 powers on him. The other change to 9th edition that made me interested in this list is for this squad of the 10 Blightlords. As I've talked about in several videos on my YouTube channel, including episode 8 that I did recently, which, by the way, got 2,100 views, which is blew away any other video I did by a mile. So thank you for all of you who watched and subscribed and commented on that. And if you're watching this for the first time, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button here in the bottom of the screen. But anyway, I mentioned that with the FAQs tied to the main rulebook of 8th edition going away, now that we're in a new edition, one of the things that changed was that there was an FAQ that applied to Cloud of Flies, the Death Guard stratagem. It wasn't. I think it was introduced to the game to address a stratagem in a different army in a different codex. But the way it was worded, it had the effect of also affecting Cloud of Flies a few months after Death Guard Codex came out. And what it did is it changed it so you could no longer use during the movement phase stratagems like Cloud of Flies at the end of the movement phase. And obviously reserves come in at the end of the movement phase, which now in 9th edition also includes strategic reserves. And yes, Sam, that's what I was referencing, using the new strategic reserve rules to spend 3 command points to outflank Magnus. And what that meant was that I could now use Cloud of Flies on the same turn that I deep strike in. So that's a huge change, because now they have no opportunity to shoot at Blightlords when they start on the table or deep strike in before I can put up Cloud of Flies, and they get no opportunity to shoot at or assault Magnus before he can try to get powers cast on him. And so those are 2 huge changes that made me want to try this list, so that basically I would typically start with almost 1,000 points reserved off the table, and not much would stay on the table for my turn 1. It would be like you see here. I really just have these 19 Poxwalkers that you see here, and I would have these 10 cultists. And the cultists would usually be behind a building, not touching the terrain, which is not really important. You don't want to touch the terrain because you want those ruins or whatever to obscure, is the new keyword, your units. So then I'd have 3 squads of 19 Poxwalkers. They would all be in range of Typhus. He would make them toughness 4. And then I would have these 2 demon princes on foot from Thousand Suns that are sitting behind the Poxwalkers, and the Foul Blightspawn would hide behind them too. And so at the start of the first turn, if my opponent wanted to shoot anything, he would have to first get through 57 Poxwalkers that were toughness 4. And one funny quirk of 9th edition is that, as it's currently worded, monsters give each other the character blocking rule, even if they were also characters. So even if someone... I usually tried to put Typhus or the characters right between 2 squads of 19 Poxwalkers, but even if they lead both of those squads, as long as all the characters are next to each other, because 2 of them are monsters, they would all block to each other as long as that last squad of Poxwalkers was closer, even if it wasn't within 3 inches. And so I don't know if that will get changed. I do notice it's really hard to show characters now once you start moving out, because of that new 3-inch rule, even if other things are closer. So that is a little tough, but for now it works. And so a lot of my opponents really expected me to start with Magnus on the table or the Blightlords on the table, and I considered it in a few rounds, but that really meant none of their anti-tank shooting could shoot at anything good. They couldn't shoot at the Blightlords, they couldn't shoot at the characters, and they couldn't shoot at Magnus. And with the game now only being 5 turns, if they go first and I reserve, and a lot of times people do want to go first. The one game where I really wanted to go second, I was forced to go first. But usually if they go first because they want to get that extra shooting in, well, that already means that out of 2 of the 5 turns of the game, they're not going to get an opportunity to shoot at the Blightlords or Magnus or probably the characters. And that makes a big difference because that round 6 is where I used to do a lot of the killing, and I noticed that as well because I ended up almost tabling all 3 of my opponents, but I still lost one of my games because I didn't get that 6th turn in and I was too far behind on the primary. So I will talk about that. So what was the overall result for the tournament? Like you see here, I tied for 2nd place. Brian tied me because he ran up a score of like 97 out of 100 on his 2nd game where he played Admech into Imperial Knights, and Admech I think is ridiculously broken at the moment. And if you face a list like Knights, I think that you can just shoot with an army like Admech, you will just dominate them. So I assume that's what happened in that game. Although I'm glad I didn't have to face him. I had to face him at the Goodbye to 8th GT I did about 2-3 weeks ago, and it's extremely hard to play into Admech as Chaos, or probably really as anyone. My only loss that was to the ultimate winner here, Rich Kilton, who it was a narrow loss, and I'll talk about that game in a second. But Rich is a great guy. I love playing him, and he won multiple majors last year back to back. And so anytime I play him, and now in 9th, as soon as I saw his list go up a few days before this event, I knew that I didn't want to really play him because it was going to be very hard for my list to beat his, especially if he forced me to go first, and he was smart because he's a good player. He forced me to go first. And that combined with a mistake I made led him win by 10 points in a really good game. And so we ended up going to the small town. It was an hour away. I hated the drive, but they prepared this little kind of YMCA type thing for us in the park, and we all had to wear masks and socially distance and all that. And so that was nice, and I know all the people here really well. Almost all the people that play here in my area, whether it's 14 people or 30 people show up for an event, almost everyone is really good. People run really diverse armies around here, so you have to be kind of prepared for anything. And everyone is generally pretty relaxed. And so Rich and I got matched up first turn. We both laughed. We said we didn't want to play each other, and we ended up setting up. And so you could see here, we had this kind of long deployment. I would have to pull up to see exactly. Well, I've probably got it here on my ITC Battles app. Let me grab it here on my phone so that I could try to remember everything that we picked and did during the tournament. And so let me see here, tournaments. Yep. And so in round 1 versus Rich, I chose Thin Their Ranks, which ended up being great because, like I said, even though I lost, I almost ended up tabling him. And so by the end of it, I had killed 116 models, which you wouldn't expect that mainly the Blightlords and Magnus could do that much damage, but they did. I chose Raise the Banners High, which ended up kind of hurting me. My list is good with that, but not on this deployment where I have to stretch out to these objectives in the middle on the very far sides, and then 2 objectives in each deployment zone on the semi-far sides. And the way I had planned to play this type of mission, the mission was 12 Scorched Earth, and I had planned when I thought about the new missions to play just for 3 objectives, or at least for 2. That's really the point of this list, because I realize you're going to get 10 out of 15 primary as long as you're holding at least 2 objectives, no matter really what mission you're playing, and so you don't even need to hold more than your opponent. You'll almost max the primary. Unfortunately, I didn't really get that opportunity here because I moved off the first objective, which is the reason I lost the game. I didn't realize that until it was too late, even though I raked up crazy points on the secondary. So that was a big lesson that I learned in playing this. And then I had Assassinate, which ended up getting me a lot of points in the last round, and the 4th and 5th rounds, and Magnus flew around and just would assault and smite and kill the hell out of characters. And he chose Linebreaker, which he ended up almost not maxing, but he did at the very end. The nice thing about that, it scored on your turn, and so he could do that with all these Death Coptas. And then he chose Raise the Banners High, which worked very well for him, and Assassinate, which didn't work well for him at all because all my characters were so tough or hidden. And so let me show you real quick. This is a photo of his army. He's been playing for a very long time, has a huge army. He can bring almost anything, and he has all these boys, trucks, Coptas, knobs. He was very smart in that he picked a list with a lot of some really tough units and then some throwaway units. And the throwaway units usually had shooting, which actually made a big difference in this game because it picked off my Poxwalkers at a fairly good pace. He also rolled really well. And now that we're in 9th edition and you don't have kill or kill more really, except for one of the secondaries that most people don't pick, it doesn't cost them anything to have these throwaway units, and they can go over the board and capture all these secondaries from. So I think that's really smart. It makes me wish I had Coptas like he does. And so let's go back here to look at Rich's list, because a lot of people have asked me what Rich was running. So here is Rich's list. And again, if you're watching, thanks to everyone who's tuning in live. Feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat, and I will take a pause and answer them. But Rich was running all Death Skulls, which I'm quickly noticing is really the popular thing to do, and it's kind of ridiculous how much value you get out of that. The whole army gets a 6-up invulnerable, and everybody gets to reroll a hit, and like a wound and a damage, and it really makes a lot of the Chaos Space Marine stuff look stupid by comparison, just for how much value you get out of that. The only good thing was, he's not getting the +1 advance and +1 charge from Evil Sons, and he was not getting my next opponent that I'll tell you about in round 2 was also Orks. At least he got a Morkanot. At least, thank goodness, he couldn't shoot it twice and all that. And so that's part of it. But here you see he had a ton of weird boys. He had a War Boss that was totally decked out on foot that went with the knobs, and he had, of course, the big mech with custom force field. Then he had these 2 squads of 30 boys, and then he had these 2 squads of 10 boys, and then he had all these Gretchen shields, and then he had some commandos that ended up not really being relevant. I think he even forgot to bring him in, maybe a small squad, and then he had this big squad of mega knobs that all had just kill saws that really pushed Magnus back for a while. But I ended up being pretty good at figuring out how to engage them how I wanted and just killing them. Including some tricks that I'll talk about. He had a knob with Wallbanner, a Pain Boy. He had these 3 Death Coptas, and again, this is what really, surprisingly helped him do really well. So if you play Orks, these are so good for the mission now. You should really consider them. And then he had all these mech guns. I hate mech guns. They were underpriced in 8th edition. They're still really underpriced in 9th edition. They single-handedly make me need to restart Magnus on reserves, even 3 of them. And it's stupid that they're D3, they're blast, so now they always do 3 shots against... even if you only have like 10 guys in the squad, if you have between 6 and 10, they always do 3 shots. I don't know if I agree with, always doing the max when you're a D3 shot. I agree with minimum 3 on a D6 shot weapon, but I feel like on a D3 shot weapon, it should be damage 2. I know Reese, on his Frontline Gaming Signals from the Frontlines podcast, he's expressed some disagreement with that as well, and I could see why after seeing it in action. And then he had these 2 trucks, which actually the little shooting and the extra 3-inch movement getting out and then moving around the table, that really helps. I'm noticing that vehicles are really useful in 9th edition, not just because they protect some of your stuff on the first turn, but a lot of units will want that extra 3 inches of movement to help get on the midfield objectives on the first turn. And so that was his list. And I wish I had more. It was such a busy game. We barely finished on time. I ended up rushing the last turn a little bit. But here you see generally the way we're set up in this kind of hammer and anvil deployment. What ended up happening in this game is I did reserve Magnus and the Blightlords, and he just took apart my Poxwalkers a lot faster than I expected with all the shooting from the Coptas and trucks and just random things. It was a little strange, and he ended up splitting a little bit of his army off to take the other side of the table from me, including what's in my backfield, and that was to be expected for me, and I just didn't get up to capture the second objective enough, and as soon as I did, I moved off the first one, because I didn't really have enough spare throwaway units. I really, in retrospect, should have kept the spare throwaway unit on my side of the table instead of splitting it off for him to kill it with Death Coptas and stuff, and so that was probably a game-losing mistake, just putting my cultists by themselves on the other side of the table, instead of keeping them safe behind all my other things, and so we had a lot of cat and mouse with him throwing up a squad of 30 boys and some Gretchen here and there, and me trying to move up with some Poxwalkers, and him posturing with, on that same side table, right close to him, that large building, that's where he had his war boss and then all these mega knobs, and I was trying to bait him into charging the Blightlords once they came down, and when they came down, they did damage to a truck, and I moved up a Blightlord to do some damage to one of the mech guns, and I was trying to bait him into charging the Blightlords once they came down and moved up, and which is what he did. I'd already done a good bit of damage to the Mega Knobs, killed one or two, and then I did a little bit of damage to the Ork boys, and then he just charged me with the War Boss, and like the 3 Mega Knobs that were left, and the like 20 or 25 boys that were left, and he forgot about the Foul Blight Spawn, which now in 9th edition is so great because it makes the other people not count as charging, and what that means is now in 9th edition, once you get to the nobody's charging part of the fight phase, the defender actually goes first, which means the Blightlords went first, took him by surprise, even though he kind of knew about it and asked me before it started the game, and the Blightlords killed most of the Ork boys. They killed like another of the Mega Knobs, so they're down to 2, and they killed the Ork War Boss. So they totally flipped the tables on him. And then he used a command, stratagem to make the War Boss fight again. And so he did some damage to my Blightlords, but at that point I kind of wrecked everything he had over there. And the rest of the game was me moving up the Blightlords, killing a few more things, but just with him moving up on in the first turn a little bit to kind of push me off that middle objective that's between the two of us there behind that barricade. That then pushed the deep strike of my Blightlords back a lot. I couldn't charge. And so I really only moved up on turn 3 to the middle and then turn 4, 5 onto his backfield. And so I wasn't holding 2 objectives for long enough, and that ended up really hurting me. What I ended up doing after that is I had Magnus. He also came in on that flank, and later he ended up flying around, and he was just smiting and killing Pain Boys and other characters by himself across the table, and so that picked up a lot of assassinate points for me. And I really got a lot more secondaries than he did, but I had just not got enough primaries because I was several times only holding 1 objective because of my mistakes, and so that's why I ended up, I think I ended up losing 85. He had 85 points. I had 75. So if even 2 of these 3 rounds I had been on at least 1 more objective, that would have been the 10 points right there. So which I could have done because I had characters and everything. So that was my mistake. And it was in this first game that I started noticing that I really don't have a choice but to bring Magnus on next to all my other stuff, which is unless I bring the Blightlords in somewhere else. And so that's not what I had expected. And the reason for that is, I can bring him on my backfield or on the other flank, although obviously it's harder when you're on this long edge deployment because then you're really far apart. But, with Thousand Suns, my Demon Princes do have that 24-inch range, and I give them the buff powers. so that Magnus can cast Smite or other things that are really hard to cast. And the issue is, those buff powers for Magnus are so important. If I've spent those command points to reserve him, those 3 command points, then when he comes on, I need to cast them, and I need to be able to cast them all game, every turn reliably. I already invested, some command points into making sure that both my Demon Princes had the +1 to cast. One from the High Magister upgrade to give an extra Warlord trait, and then I give him a Magister for +1 to cast. And then the other one with the Cult of Magic Arcane Focus Relic that also gives +1 to cast. And so being able to cast a -1 to hit and the +1 to the invulnerable save is already more likely, but you could still roll those ones. And so I really realized I didn't want to risk that at all. And so I would bring Magnus on, and I would bring him in behind my Demon Princes or on the flank next to my Demon Princes nearby within the 9 inches, because I really needed Magnus to give the reroll 1s on psychic tests to those 2 Demon Princes. Now, that ended up working because I think the entire tournament I never once failed a Gaze of Fate or a Temporal Manipulation or a Weaver of Fates or a Glamour of Tzeentch, which were the 4 powers on my 2 Demon Princes, because between the +1 and the reroll ones, it was just extremely reliable, which is really great. However, it meant that I couldn't just bring Magnus in on the other side of the table, take back a flank, smite something, and so then I realized this list is kind of everything's more or less all next to each other, which has its benefits. Maybe Magnus is in range of the Foul Blight Spawn, or something like that. But it really meant that the outflanking was more of a survivability and a head fake type thing, rather than something that really gave me the advantage to be somewhere else on the table with Magnus. And then, it was the same thing for the Blightlords. The Blightlords probably want to come down near the Foul Blight Spawn. And the other thing about the Blightlords is, usually in every other list I've done, they deep strike with Typhus. And especially now that I can give him the reroll 1. So I don't need to bring a Death Guard Terminator Lord and a Death Guard Terminator Sorcerer. Typhus combines both of those things when I spend 1 command point to give him that upgrade, which is fantastic. I'm so happy about that. But in this list, because Magnus and the Blightlords are already almost 1,000 points, I can't reserve Typhus. And even if I could, in this list, I am reliant on these 57 Poxwalkers to be my screen, so Typhus needs to start on the table. So I also no longer have that large amount of flexibility about where I bring down the Blightlords, especially since the whole point is to make them Cloud of Flies and be behind the Poxwalkers. And so neither the Blightlords nor Magnus have that much flexibility about where they come on, despite being in reserves. And so that's basically how that game went. And so let me walk you guys through the second game. The second game actually was also against Orks, and it was also against what are they called? The Bad Moons, or the Death Skulls, who are all supposed to be blue, but obviously people will run them as whatever they want based on what they have. And so here you kind of see the deployment. This was kind of reversed on the game length table. Here we were starting on the shorter edges, and his list was actually quite similar to Rich's with a few big differences. And so let me walk you all through his list here. Let's see. Okay, so here is his list. He had Big Mech with custom force field as well, just like Rich. Just like Rich, he has this souped up war boss that combines biggest boss with the invulnerable save, which is annoying. I'm sad that Orks got that with the Killy Claw. The only difference is this one was on a bike. And then he had a lot less weird boys, but of course he still had the jump and all that. Although it doesn't say on here that he has a jump, but maybe that's in a different, yeah, that's in a different attachment. So he took another attachment. So for this one, he, like Rich, he had 2 big 30-man squads of boys, but then he also had a third one, which gave me a lot of trouble during the game, although I ended up managing it. He also had a Pain Boy. One big difference here is he had this Morkanaut, which was pretty shooty, pretty good. And of course, he's got all these new stratagems and upgrades from Psychic Awakening that made Orks even better. And then he had this thing that I knew about because I've seen it before, really ridiculous and I think broken, which is that, you can bring this Burn Bomb, it's only 155 points, and you spend 1 command point, and it's this giant 6-inch bubble off this large flyer base that automatically does D3 mortal wounds to everything within 6 inches. And and now in 9th edition, where the board size is smaller, you've got less room to deploy. Your characters all have to be really close to your models because you need the 3 inches to protect them under the new character rule against shooting in order to not get shot. That was rough because those things can just blow you up. And I knew that was going to happen, and so I deployed against it and I tried to bait him, which ended up working, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then he has this other attachment, Big Mech with custom force field, Weird Boy with a jump, and then he had a ton of these smasher guns that, again, I hate and I think are stupid underpriced. He had 8 of them, and so I definitely had to reserve Magnus and the Blightlords here in this game. Thanks everyone for tuning in to watch. By the way, like I said earlier, if anyone has any comments or questions, just type it into the chat. I am watching the chat while we go around here. And so let's go back to a couple pictures from that second round against that Ork list. So, you know, I started with Typhus and the Foul Blightspawn more in the middle. And again, Typhus in range of all these Poxwalker squads, and now in 9th edition you don't know who's going to really go first when you pick some of the stuff, and so I just was very paranoid. I ended up choosing to go first, I think, if I remember right, but let's see if I got a picture of it. Yeah, there's his Morkanot. He just had all this shooting stuff in the back and all these boys in the front, including the squad that, you know, the squads that he could jump. And so what I ended up doing is, in that initial deployment, you could see here on the right side that I have, you see just hidden behind the building, I have these two these Thousand Suns Demon Princes are next to each other. So they're far away from the other two characters. He ended up barely finding a way to get my Foul Blightspawn as well, who did fine with the Feel No Pain. But he put 1 wound on one of the Demon Princes and 3 wounds on the other. What he didn't realize is I was baiting him with the Demon Princes because I had Temporal Manipulation. I knew in the first turn, or I think he ended up going first actually. And so, the way I deployed, he was still able to get them, but I knew on the first turn, before Magnus even came on the table, I was going to cast Temporal Manipulation and heal D3 on one of those Demon Princes. So I really wanted him to attack the Demon Princes rather than Typhus. Let me read what's in the chat here. Shane Kent says, top 3 Death Guard units after 9th edition dropped. That's a really good question. I would say Foul Blightspawn. Blightlord Terminators and Death Shroud both have a lot of downsides, including being really expensive. I don't know. They're a core part of my list, but I don't know if I put them in there. I think the Filers are incredible for 140 points now. So I think if you're doing Poxmongers, there's a very good argument that they're in the top 3. Foul Blightspawn is probably number 1. I would say you can make a really good case that Typhus is in there because he's 165 points. He only went up 10. You can now give him reroll 1s, which used to be the only thing he didn't have. He can cast 2 powers, which is great because what you really need if you have Death Shroud or Blightlords, or even if you have a big squad of Plague Marines, you really need the -1 to be hit, Miasma, and you need Blades of Putrefaction for +1 to wound and the Mortal Wounds on a 6. And so. And he can deny 1 power, he has 6 wounds, he has Feel No Pain, 2 up normal, 4 up invulnerable. The fact that he's really slow matters a little less on the smaller board sizes, so I think Typhus is in there. So I think Typhus, the Foul Blightspawn, and the Filers. Maybe honorable mentions, Mephitic Blighthaulers. I also think Poxwalkers are overpriced now, just like a lot of troops that aren't Primaris, but they're less overpriced than Cultists because they're 1 more point than Cultists, but they are they have a Feel No Pain, and they're fearless, which is nice, and they can be Toughness 4, Strength 4, and they can get models back. And so I think Poxwalkers aren't bad either, just as a kind of troop you're forced to take. I think Typhus is a great value now. Plague Burst Crawlers, Sam, you know, them going up by 30 points hurts so much. I may consider switching to a list with my 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, but 170 points is really expensive now, especially if you compare it to how ridiculously underpriced an Intercessor is, or the new Space Marine bikes, or the guys with multi-meltas. Any of the new models along with the old intercessors. For Space Marines, they're really trying to just sell models, which is really shady. All the new stuff that's coming out. If you look at that bunker or whatever that came out now that actually moves 3 inches, or that little turret platform, it's like 80 points for like 4 last cannons or something. It's like, I don't know, a bunch of wounds, toughness 5s. None of the points make sense compared to Space Marines. And there's a few other strange things. And I think Chaos is a little overpriced. And so 170 points is tough. I still think it's worth it with Poxmongers, the 4-up invulnerable save, now firing in combat. You can move and shoot the mortars. It's just, I would feel much better about them if they were like 150, 160 points. But it's not points efficient enough to be automatic top 3 for Death Guard. What I would say is probably another thing that I should mention is Chaos Spawn. As soon as I get my painted, I want to play with them. It's 1 command point to make 5 of them. Give up a 5-up Feel No Pain when they're toughness 5, 4 wounds each, and they're only 23 points each. And then on top of that, Death Guard can actually give them a 5-up invulnerable save by putting them next to the guy with the bell, the Noxious Blightbringer, I think, if I remember right. And you want him next to him anyway because he gives you the move twice for advance. When they move 7 inches, they need that. And so those would be my top options. Let's get back to this game here. I ended up deploying like this. I healed up my Demon Prince, and then he ended up jumping on one of the objectives. He was trying to shoot me, shoot down my Poxwalkers, which was nice. But I ended up being able to bring on Magnus, get all the powers on him, still be within range to cast buffs on the Blightlords, and then he could not shoot during his turn 2 shooting phase. He could not shoot the and maybe I did go first. Maybe I misremembered that. He could not shoot the Blightlords because the Poxwalkers were still there. He couldn't shoot the Poxwalkers with everything because they're on the other side of this big building. And so he had to have this Morkanaut and those 4 guns back there shoot into the yellow Poxwalkers that you see right there. So that really worked out. And he took a few pot shots at Magnus, but he was just so deterred by the fact that he already had full wounds and 3-up invulnerable save and -1 on him, so that he almost didn't want to bother. And then he was trying to kill those Blightlords because he realized he was going to be in trouble on that flank. And on the other flank, he had to deal with Magnus and those 2 Demon Princes. He thought, I really need to kill the Poxwalkers. But, it takes a decent amount to kill them. They die fast, but you have to get through 19 of them, and he just ran out of guns by the time he would have gotten to the Blightlords. In fact, he didn't even manage to kill all of the Poxwalkers. Yeah, Shane, that's what I talked about at the beginning of the show, is that, and I talked about it in Episode 8 as well, when I talked about the changes to all the Chaos Armies in 9th edition. There was an FAQ after Death Guard Codex came out at the start of 8th edition that made it that you can't use during the movement phase stratagems at the end of the movement phase, and that's now gone. So unless they change that, which I hope they don't, because Death Guard is one of the only armies that has this old outright stratagem, you can use it after Deep Strike at the moment, which is part of the reason why I built the whole list the way I did. And so I came down here, and long story short, those Blightlords on the left ended up really evaporating all the Orks over there. And he was very afraid to come too close to the other objective. He tried, but, I was just hitting him with smites and things. And so it's important to note at this point that, and some people won't like this, but I was using at this event, and I checked with the tournament organizer beforehand, I was smiting sometimes, not every phase, but, usually at least once a phase, I was doing a second smite with Magnus, because as you may know if you play Thousand Suns or Grey Knights, for some reason they took away the rule that says, the warp charge doesn't increase to cast smite for you, which sucks. On the other hand, maybe it was an oversight, probably, but the way they wrote the new Psychic Power rules, they have all these rules about smite, but there's nothing in there that says you can't cast it more than once on the same cycle. All that says is if your power is something other than Smite, you can only cast it once in the phase. And so Magnus, of course, his normal Smite is a D6, and if he gets an 11 or higher result, then he adds +2 to cast. So for him, it's a natural roll of a 9 or higher. He does 2d6 mortal wounds. Now you can still roll, get 1 mortal wound on a normal Smite or 2 mortal wounds on a super Smite. But if you can cast it more than once, it's very helpful. And I tended to roll quite well during this tournament. The thing is, you would think I would just cast Smite 3 times every time, or I could spend a command point at the end of the Psychic phase with the Thousand Sun Stratagem to cast a 4th power, with Magnus. However, another reason I built the list the way I did is because Prescience is so important. I would never run Blightlords without Prescience, or at least a Ferryman strat on the new Play Company, give him +1 hit and shooting. But Prescience is so much better. It doesn't cost a command point. It also works in the melee phase, which is really important. Prescience is just so important with Blightlords, and so it's so hard to take Death Guard by themselves if you want to take Blightlords, because they really need the Prescience, and of course they benefit from Warp Time and Death Hex. And so a lot of times I'm casting Death Hex and maybe Warp Time, and for sure Prescience with Magnus, and I might not even get a Smite in. But I tried in this game and in my 3rd game to really just cast Prescience and maybe 1 other power, and then Smite at least once, maybe twice, possibly 3 times if I only cast Prescience. And so the nice thing about Prescience, it's great at taking down these big boy squads, or at putting into something else. Although really in this game I ended up putting all my Smites into boys pretty much, and then like 1 mech gun, just because I needed to get rid of them. Let's see if I have any other pictures here of what I was doing. And so yeah, here you can kind of see he ended up running away with his mech guns. Magnus ended up basically staying where he was the whole time just to get the bonuses. I think actually that's not true. This was maybe 3rd round. In the 4th and 5th round, he had to go back into my deployment zone where those blue Orks are to just start killing Orks and holding them off of the he had to hold the Orks off the objective, my backfield, because I knew he wasn't going to get the one where Magnus already was. The Blightlords were going to keep him and off the other objective, and I had some objectives secured over there, these Poxwalkers that slowly died, and so he had the one in his backfield, and then he wanted the one in my backfield, and so I had to go over there with Magnus and warp timed over there, and killed a whole bunch of boys, and then he ended up green tiding them and bringing them back again. But they couldn't kill Magnus, and they forgot to charge, one time when they came in. And so it just ended up working out for me to have Magnus there in my backfield. On the other objective, it was a little dicier because he had this wounded Morkanaut that barely lived, and then he repaired it, and then he came towards the objective, and then he brought in his, really dangerous war boss on a bike with all the CP upgrades and the Killy Claw, and he charged them both into my Blightlords, but I rolled extremely well on my invulnerable saves, which was fantastic. And then I also I rolled pretty well just in general with them, and I ended up losing a few more when the war boss died, and he swung again, but in the end I was able to kill the Morkanaut and the war boss, and then Magnus was killing the boys in the back. And so I forgot to mention what what we each picked as our objectives in this second game. So, but again, it was similar to the first game against Rich Kilton. In this one, I had picked thin their ranks again, and again, I just like in the game with Rich, I almost maxed it because I came close to tabling him. I got like 11 or 12 thin their rank points out of 15. I got Vital Ground, which is the unique one for this mission. This mission was number 22, Battle Lines. And that's the unique secondary. Most of the secondaries I don't like that much. But most of the unique secondaries from the missions, I mean. But this one's good because this one really only needs you... It doesn't get you that many points, but it's pretty reliable. Because if you're grabbing either of the ones in the middle, you're getting at least, I think 2 points a turn or something like that. And then the last one is while we stand, we fight. And I realized in the first game against Rich that I really struggled to figure out what was a good secondary to take in my list. That's one of the weaknesses of the list I put together. And I realized I really had a hard time picking good secondaries with this list because the Poxwalkers aren't very mobile and they die quickly. So all those move around the table ones I can't do. I realized the Blightlords and Magnus, like I said earlier, can't really just go all over the table. They have to land in certain places, and so I had a very hard time picking secondaries. And this one ended up being good in this list because, like I said at the beginning, it really, people are deterred from shooting at Magnus because he comes in and he has all these powers on him all game that are very reliable in this list. And then the Blightlords have Cloud of Flies, and by the time you get to them, it takes a while. And so what I can do is actually the 3 most expensive characters, where I pick one of the Demon Princes, I pick Magnus, and I pick Typhus. And Typhus isn't that easy to kill either, especially when you only have 5 rounds and I have all these Poxwalkers in front. And people are building their lists a little to be less killy and a little bit more for the objectives. And so when you keep that in mind, he really never had any way of keeping me from scoring those 15 points on that one. All I had to do was keep Magnus alive, keep Typhus alive, and keep Demon Prince alive, and that's something I play to do anyway. And unlike some of the old ITC missions, you don't get like, oh, if you kill Magnus half dead, or, you do so many wounds on characters. There's still one like that for vehicles and monsters, but not for that particular, secondary, because that's a secondary I pick. I pick to keep my characters alive with while we stand, we fight. And so unless you kill them completely, you're not going to get them. And the other thing reason I put this list the way to put it together the way I did is when you can bring Magnus on and have these buffs on him before he ever gets shot at, and hopefully throughout the game with the way I built the psychic power reliability. The other thing that comes through on that is with the Psychic Awakening Ritual of the Damned, one of the cool new stratagems they got is if you cast a power on a 9 or higher, you could spend 1 command point and get D3 wounds back with that caster. And Magnus, with the +2 of the cast, will naturally hit that on average with the cast. And he casts, 3 or 4 times a turn. So for him, it's really good. And by the way, I'm getting a message. My frame rate is dropping a bit. So if that's happening, I apologize. I'm not sure why that's happening. But the point is, when Magnus comes on and always have these buffs on him, unless people focus all their firepower into him right away, which is hard for them to do, and they also have to worry about the Blightlords moving up on them. If you only do a few wounds to him a turn, like on this one, he came on and he did like 6 wounds or 5 wounds to him on the second turn because he had the powers up. Well, on my turn, I'm going to cast Temporal Manipulation on him and heal D3, and then probably at one point I'm going to spend a command point after Magnus gets a good cast, and I'm going to heal D3 more. So on average, I'm probably healing 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 wounds a turn on Magnus. And so then you have to start basically all over again to try to wear him down again with all the buffs. And so that's another reason why the outflanking works pretty well, because when they only have turns 3, 4, 5, maybe bottom of turn 2 to shoot at him, and he always has the powers up, and then he can the other person's army is now more expensive, there's a little less guns to shoot at him, and so you just add that all together, and you can heal 2d3 a turn on him. It just does increase the durability of him by quite a lot, and I really noticed that in these games. And of course, the other thing that it distracts from him is, maybe he's casting some smites or something, but those Blightlords, in addition to being a big melee threat that are taking the midfield and those objectives, the way I build mine, I've got 8 of them with Combi Plasma. And so, that makes them super expensive, and people aren't used to that. But, they suddenly notice when I drop in turn 2, I Cloud of Flies them, they can't get shot at, but they can shoot back at 18 inches with Rapid Fire Combi Plasma. I hit him with Prescience. Well, even if I roll a 1, I'm re-rolling it with Typhus, but even if I roll a 1 again, it's not going to kill them because I've got the +1, and so the result is not a 1. Even if the roll is, and so they don't die from plasma, at least the way it is currently in their codex, and most people's codexes. And so I can spend 1 more command point for Veterans of the Long War, and so suddenly I have 16 shots at 18 inches, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, that are strength 8 with +1 to wound, AP -3, 2 damage each, and by the way, Magnus can cast Death Hex out at 18 inches. to strip an invulnerable save off of something. So if they come down and they kill something that my opponent really was planning to have around from range, never mind the fact you have to worry about their melee, that also tends to distract from Magnus quite a bit. Oh, yeah. Yeah, William, thanks for checking in. All these live videos that I record, every one of my episodes, they automatically go on the channel. So you can go back and watch any of them. And I only had like 15 people watching my episode 8 live, and then I had over 2,100 people who watched it later. So don't worry about that. And you can go back and start from the beginning anytime and see my list and all that. The only thing I will tell you is that YouTube has changed in the last half a year, so that it takes them way longer to upload live streams, because after live stream ends, it's unavailable for like 24 to 48 hours, and it's kind of a crapshoot when they're going to have it up, because they kind of recode it on their back end automatically and then upload it as a video. And so for a day or two after I end this live stream, the video is not going to be available, and there's just nothing I can do about that. And or I'm hoping it'll be available within 24 to 48 hours, and after that, it's available forever. But yeah, you'll be able to go back and watch it after in a day or two. And so so that's how my game went. I really raked up a high score. And so let's go into my third game. I only have this one blurry picture from there. You can see we kind of had a hammer and anvil deployment again. Just so everyone knows, before I forget this time, my third game, it was against Scott, who's a very good player, and he had a pure pure Space Wolf army that I'll explain in a second. But just so you know, the mission, if you're checking it with your GT packet at home from the new chapter approved, this was mission 31 Overrun, which had one objective middle of each deployment zone on this kind of Dawn of War style deployment, and then we each had two objectives on opposite sides of the table that were very close to the deployment zone, like a few inches away. So there's 6 objectives on the table total, so you can see here I deployed very much in the middle on this Dawn of War style objective. And his were raise the banners high, cut off the head. No, I'm sorry, that was mine. Cut off the head, raise the banners high, because here I started on all these objectives, so I was able to keep my banners up most of the game. And engage in all fronts, which ended up sucking because I couldn't get really into recon. But I just didn't have good secondaries against his army, and he had engaged in all fronts as well, which is better for him. He has these Space Wolves coming at me quickly with transports. Raise the banners high and assassinate. And assassinate did not work out well for him, because, like I said earlier, I have all these tough characters. And yeah, Geek Abaddon, thanks for tuning in. Catch the beginning whenever this goes live in a day or two. No problem. And if there's something earlier in the beginning, you feel free to leave comments in the YouTube video. I had a ton of people commenting on my episode 8, the one that got over 2,100 views, and I responded to every single one of those, and I had some good discussions in there. So if you're watching this and you're not live, just comment on the video and I will get to you. And also, if you're watching for the first time, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. And so let's go over Scott's list. And again, if I have any frame rate drop, I apologize for that. I shouldn't be, but I'm not sure how to optimize my computer, even though my computer's a beast. And so let's get over here and go to the Space Wolves list that I played against, which I thought was kind of cool. I have Magnus and Thousand Suns along with some Death Guard, and they're fighting Space Wolves. So that's one reason I picked the background that you see right here. I thought it was fitting, considering I played against Space Wolves in my third game. And so here's that list. It's a pretty straightforward list. He had his 2 HQs were this Wolf Priest with this Song of the Wolfkin and Armor of Rust. And the Armor of Rust is one of your picks, someone within 3 inches, and they fight last. I ended up getting very few points from that cut off the head secondary that I picked, but it ended up working out for me because I didn't get a lot, because I didn't kill his Wolf Priest until later, because he was hiding in the back of his deployment zone the whole game. On the other hand, that meant that his Wolf Priest was not there with those buffs and the Saga of Rust for some really crucial melee. So I think I ended up giving up some secondary points in order to, lose the battle, win the war type of deal. And so Ragnar, I never played against him. I just knew that he was super good, in melee and gave a ton of buffs to like all these characters, all these other units around him. Thankfully, ended up not coming into play. I'll tell you why. And then I have these. He had these intercessor squads. He had an infiltrator squad. He's getting some of those recon style points. And then he had these 5-man Wolfen squads. And he had this Blade Guard veteran squad, which are just really cheap for what they do. But in the end, it ended up not mattering against me as well. The Wolfen are very scary when they fight on death. Because I'm going to do most of my killing in melee. And then he had this Relic Leviathan Dreadnought that I was super afraid of. With the Storm Cannon Rays, it was quite common to see at this tournament, even though it went up by 50 points, Space Marine players were still taking this damn thing all the time, at least one in almost all the lists. And so, if people thought they would lose it, they could reserve it. It's only like 2 command points to reserve it from an outflank, and you come on and you shoot. So this thing is still as dumb as ever. William, how does that Armor of Rust work with Foul Blightspawn? The Armor of Rust, which is very similar to the Drukhari relic on like the grotesque escorts, those characters from Drukhari from the fleshy monstrosity or whatever those detachments are called. They have a relic that also makes you fight last. So it's like a warlord trait. You pick someone within 3 inches. It's the same thing. And that's better because they just pick someone and say, you fight last. And you pick whatever the scary thing is. Whereas the Foul Blightspawn one just says you don't fight first. So that if you get charged, if both go off, like it's your turn and you get charged, yes, you both count as charging, so normally you would go before whatever charged you, but then they use that ability on you, and so even though the other person doesn't count as charging, they go first anyway, because whatever your scary unit is fights last. So the other stuff is better, but on the other hand, you can have up to 3 Foul Blightspawn, and there's a Ferryman stratagem for 2 command points at the start of someone's movement phase, that for the rest of the turn, you can double the range to 14 inches, and it's a 7 inches to begin with, and it affects more than one unit. And you could always bring the relic that extends the range of your auras by 3 inches. And so there's a reason the other ones are more powerful. It's because the Foul Blightspawn aura is more easily available. Yeah, that's exactly it, Vectator Mask. And so the other thing he had this Repulsor Executioner, also very shooty. Then he had this Impulsor. I didn't realize that the Primaris vehicles, they have these special rules that you can get out after things move, which ended up being pretty good for his stuff. In terms of the actual game, like I said, this is kind of the middle of my deployment zone. I barely moved up my first turn, and he was surprised because I picked this secondary where I have to capture table quarters, which ended up biting me. But this ended up being the right decision because he ended up moving the Dreadnought into the middle of the table, and he ended up moving, his, a scout squad or Primaris scout squad and like a squad of intercessors closer. And so I could kind of bunch up here in the middle. And what ended up happening is I came on and I death hexed his Leviathan, and I tried to smite the hell out of it, and I tried to shoot it with these overcharged plasma Veteran of the Long War Blightlords. And I forgot, on top of the fact that this Leviathan is really good, Space Marines also have the stupid stratagems, where it's one stratagem to get a 5-up save against mortal wounds from psychic powers, and then also reduce damage, by half, so the overcharging didn't help. And so he kept it alive, but it was injured. What that did, though, is it made him really have to come to me, and I had, my Foul Blightspawn in there, and he ended up forgetting about the Foul Blightspawn, charging into all the Blightlords, and then they killed one of the 2 squads of Wolfen and did a little bit of damage back, and that kind of messed up his whole entire plan. And that by then I was able the next turn to kill the Leviathan in the middle. And so that all he really had at that point was the backup squad of Wolfen coming in the second wave with Ragnar. But he had expected to keep me pinned in place, and instead I was able to move up on his Dreadnought and on Ragnar. And, I killed Ragnar, I think, with like shooting or psychic powers, yeah, I killed him with like a smite. You know, I got a d6 smite and rolled a 6 or something like that. Or I rolled 7, which is just enough to kill him. And so he really did not expect for me to immediately collapse the first wave of Wolfen and then roll up on him in the middle and then just absorb the charge from the Blade Guard in the second wave of Wolfen, lose some more Blightlords. Rolled really well for their saves, so I got lucky. But by then, you know, Magnus had no wounds on him. The Demon Princess didn't have wounds on him. I killed the Impulsor. I killed both squads of Wolfen. I killed the Blade Guard. I killed Ragnar. I killed the Leviathan. I was about to kill the Grav Tank, and then all he had left at that point, and I killed, you know, an Intercessor squad, a Scout squad. All he had left at that point was kind of the Wolf Priest guy hiding in the way back in his deployment zone, and then on the other side, you see there on the left, you know, 5 Intercessors. And so, and I also flew Magnus over there at the warp time, killed, you know, that Wolf Priest with smites. There's nothing he could do about it. And so all he had left was like, you know, a mostly dead little Rhino floating transport and an Intercessor squad, and I had just run up the score, and we called it at that point. And you know, what really helped here is his list really had some good invulnerable saves, and you know, being able to smite, especially, you know, more than once. This is probably the game where I did the whole, you know, smite more than once with Magnus the most, just because I had to burst out damage on those first 2 turns where I came on against his scary stuff. So that helped, and if I wasn't able to do that, I might have to change the list a little bit, but on the other hand, then I would have a lot more ability for Magnus to cast Doombolt or Infernal Gaze or things that could be targeted smites, which also would have been nice. And we did have a little bit of a dispute because he moved in, he did the assault move and moved into my Blightlords, and then afterwards, trying to be nice, I was like, you may want to bump up one of those guys back a little bit because he's touching Foul Blight Spawn, you didn't declare him, and you know, it doesn't really matter, but you probably only want to charge what you declared. And then he's like, well, I didn't realize that model was your Foul Blight Spawn, and they all look the same to me, and can I move again? I was like, well, no, because, you know, you knew I had him, and I told you at the start, and he only has value if you forget about him. You know, he's kind of a surprise. And we talked about him at the start, and, you know, I was going to point him out to you. And so he wasn't happy about that, which I understand, because, you know, it is a bit of a trap, but that's a little bit the point of that model. Because otherwise, you know, you would just ignore him or move around him or charge just out of his range. And I had kept all my guys together from the beginning, so I wasn't trying to, like, you know, shell game them or anything. And so that's what I really like about the Blightlords is now that they can Cloud of Flies when they come on, it's nice because, you know, you can't shoot them unless you get rid of all those Poxwalkers usually. But if you charge them, you know, they're going to be protected by that Foul Blight Spawn, and they will get to fight first. So that's kind of a win-win for the unit. Then if you have Magnus cast the Prescience on them, you know, they're going to shoot really well, and then when they get charged, they're also hitting really well. And, of course, in a game like this, I did a lot of damage because the Flails of Corruption, when you get charged, they're 3d3 hits each, so you're going to get an average of 12 you know, attacks out of the 2 guys in that unit. They're hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, but then on every 5 or 6 of those 12 is another d3, because it's another attack, and you get a d3 hits per attack. And so, and then of course I have the fact that they do mortal wounds on 6s. Used to also be 5s when you could stack Blades of Putrefaction Power and Veterans of the Long War Stratagem. Unfortunately, can't do that anymore. That really hurts Blightlords when they cap the 2 wound at max +1. But, you know, they still do a lot of damage because those flails are 2 damage and they bleed through. They can be AP 3, you know, on the higher wound rolls because Blightlords have the special rule about improving AP and melee. And so that worked out really well for me. Yeah, Geek, I agree. That was the thing that I felt, you know, if you tell me something at the start, and, you know, and I forget to ask where it is in your army, you know, then it doesn't really matter if he thinks they look similar. I think they look similar. I got to ask where the models are. And to be honest, my models are at least the normal models. Whenever I play people with Vexator Mask or other stuff, just so often they're like these little goofy conversions and are not really painted, and they're like almost proxies. And a lot of times I'm like, okay, all your sisters are like made so they almost all look the same. I can't tell which of your 7s, you know, Sisters of Battle characters is the one that I need to worry about. And I have to constantly ask. But I do ask because I need to remember where they are. And yeah, I agree, Geek. I agree. But I mean, that was the only thing. He's a great opponent, very good player, very good attitude. He was unhappy about how this game went, but I just had a lot of things go my way. And yeah, Shane, it's not anymore. I mentioned at the start of the episode, it's kind of a give and take. Right now, Thousand Suns and Grey Knights suddenly have the increasing warp charge to all the abilities, just like everybody else when you cast Smite. So I did at one point fail a Smite with Magnus because it was a second or third attempt, and he rolled very low. So even with the +2, he didn't get it. And if he starts getting hurt and he's not getting that +2 anymore, suddenly you're not really getting those Smites to be as good, or you might even start failing them. On the other hand, currently, like I said, there's nothing keeping you from smiting more than once. Because of how they wrote the new Smite rules. They give you like a million rules that are about Smite, but nothing says you can't cast it more than once. And so some of the playtesters, at least one group that I know of has said they think that's unintended. I don't know. To be honest, they made so many mistakes with the points values and a little oversight still in the new rulebook, even though it's better in 8th edition, that I just don't know what's coming. And there's a lot of stuff missing from the FAQs from Psychic Awakening still. We need to see the FAQ for the main rulebook. We'll just see. And if Magnus loses that, I may not do this list anymore, because at that point I don't know if Magnus is worth it, but we'll see. Like I said, I do rely on him a lot to cast Prescience, and often Death Hex, and sometimes Warp Time. And so he may only get to cast Smite once, if ever, normally anyway, if I really need to cast all those other powers to help the Blightlords. I did have, maybe one round or two at some point where, he cast Smite 2 or 3 times and I just gave up on the other powers because I was so desperate to kill Orks off an objective or something. Or maybe I was rolling low on my Smites to see how many wounds they got. But, you only need one good Smite and you get to do 10 or 11 mortal wounds on an Orc Boy unit or something, and that will change things for you. So that's basically how my games went. That's why I picked the list that I did. It's not really what I want to play. I want to play with the Death Guard Defilers or Death Guard Spawn. I don't have those painted. Really sucks. Hope to get them painted at some point. I think Space Marines could be very strong, but those aren't painted for me either. And so I have huge demon armies that are painted, but demons got hurt so badly, especially in the troops, that I'm on the fence. I'm considering doing a list that basically is this list, but no Death Guard. Instead, it's like 60 Plague Bearers and 18 Nurglings, and just flooding the board and having very little offense. I don't know if that would work or not. Plague Bearers are pretty expensive, but they can also stretch out a lot further than the Poxwalkers because they have larger size bases. So I'm still definitely up in the air. Yeah, Michael, no problem that you missed it. It's going to be on video on demand. As I was saying earlier, I went through the list and all the games, all the matches. But once this live stream ends, YouTube now is kind of slow. It takes 1 or 2 turns. 1 or 2 days, maybe like 20 to 40 hours, maybe even longer, for YouTube to do whatever encoding it does on its end to then take the live stream and put it in HD on the back on the channel. So once this live stream ends, it's going to disappear for a day or two, and then it will be back. Or at least I really hope it is uploading in HD, because I went through a lot of trouble to make sure my last episode was finally in HD, true HD for the first time, without a blurry background and all that. And so we'll see. But yeah, everything will be available, video on demand. So that's how my games went. That's why I built the list like I did. That said, I do have some thoughts about what I learned about 9th edition in general, and match play in general for 9th edition with the new missions and all that. It's really hard to keep track of 9 missions, so I did a lot of mental preparing before this tournament. I looked at all 9 missions. I looked at all the secondaries that are unique to each mission, and I thought for each mission, how will I deploy my army, and I followed kind of that game plan. And I have some thoughts about what I learned about the missions and the secondaries in 9th edition. But before I go into that, I'm curious if any of you, we have like 13 people or so watching live right now. I'm going to take a quick, break here for a second and shout out a little more food. What do you all think? Do you have any questions about my list, about Death Guard, Thousand Suns, about how the tournament went? Do you have any lists that you're considering trying? I'd like to hear your thoughts before I just go totally into what I'm planning on doing, or after this tournament, or kind of my lessons learned about 9th edition match play. Yeah, feel free to ask questions. I see one question already. What do you think about Mortarion? Yeah, and another question, Mortarion or Blightlords? It's funny, good questions, because I've been wondering about that ever since the tournament. Because they're almost the same amount of points. The Blightlords, the way I run them, are 500 points. Mortarion is now 490 points. So, normally I have a low opinion of Mortarion, except in very specific lists, because he can't get anywhere before being shot. However, what I'm really realizing now, after having played at a 9th edition tournament on 9th edition size tables, is that people say the board is smaller, and it is. But more important than the fact that the board is smaller is that almost every army in the game now has to come to the middle of the board on turn 1. Latest turn 2. Because you're going to have these objectives in the middle, and most of the deployments, there are a few deployments, but there's 9 missions, so only a small minority of them really give you more than one objective in your deployment, or give you, some objectives that are close to your deployment zone. For the most part, you need to move into the middle. At the very least, you need to typically move at least a little bit out of your deployment zone. And it's not like 8th edition where the other person could basically start like 30 inches away from you, because you've got a 24-inch deployment zone, and they would start more than 6 inches back, and they would have this whole gunline army. Gunline armies are still super obnoxious, and shooting is still too strong in this edition, but they're going to have at least some units, some fast units, some sacrifice units. They probably are going to bring got people on foot who are objective secured, because they don't want to, get swamped by orc boys or something, or nurglings in the middle. And so suddenly, people are going to be even gunline armies are going to have things they're throwing in the middle. And so all of a sudden, warp time is not as crucial for Mortarion, because he can just move 12, then he's already in the middle of the table usually, and the other person's army is probably right next to him or not that far away, unless you went top of turn 1. You still probably want to bring warp time with him, but you're no longer just dragging Mortarion across this empty table on hammer and anvil to the way back. So I think that by itself makes it better. Also, having this smaller board also means, with things being more clumped together, including the characters needing to stick very closely to the units that they're buffing, that means, I think, probably his 7-inch aura for the -1 toughness and doing all the mortal wounds is going to be a lot better. Of course, there's the ability to reserve him. It's not as good reserving Mortarion, because Magnus can come on the table, and smite and cast some powers, and maybe cast multiple smites at least for the moment. Mortarion, when he comes on the table, he can maybe shoot the lantern, right? But really, all he could do to be effective on turn 2, potentially bottom of turn 2, is make a charge. And Death Guard, that's the one thing that all of us who play Death Guard hate about Psychic Awakening. It still did not give anything to Death Guard to help make the charge. There's no plus charge, there's no reroll charge, nothing. And so you're just doing a naked 9-inch charge when you bring Mortarion on from strategic reserves, which is really unfortunate. And That was one reason why I think I did well with this list at this tournament that I forgot to mention. One of the biggest reasons I bring the Thousand Suns is because of Gaze of Fate, which was always a really good ability, but now that the command point reroll is all the dice in 9th edition, you can no longer try to make a charge with Blightlords out of Deep Strike, roll a 6 and a 1, only reroll the 1. If you reroll it with a command point, you're re-rolling both dice, which dramatically cuts down the odds of making your charge out of Deep Strike. But, in that second game versus those Orks where I brought the Blightlords in on the flank, and then I charged them into all these Orks. Let me see if I find the photo. You see there, I had to come in 9 inches away. However, and I failed the charge on the Deep Strike. But because I had my Gaze of Fate that I saved for this charge specifically, Gaze of Fate is still on a single die. That meant I rolled like a 5 or 6 on one of them. I kept that, and I re-rolled what was like a 1 or a 2, and then that gave me the 9-inch charge. And then I came in and I obliterated that unit right away, which completely, changed the game and put a lot of pressure on him. He was not expecting that. And so... if you want, you can still, you probably want to bring like Thousand Suns anyway because you want somebody to be there to give Mortarion the warp time. You may want to give him prescience so that he gets all these extra attacks on 5s and 6s because each Death to the False Emperor is going to be an extra 3 attacks when you're using his other profile. So all that sort of stuff. And so... at that point, you probably have Gaze of Fate as well, and so it's not that crazy to come in with an outflank if you spend 3 command points to reserve Mortarion, and then try to make the 9-inch charge naked. It's just, at least the Blightlords, if they fail, they at least came down and they shot pretty hard with the plasma, whereas Mortarion doesn't get to do that. The bright side is now you could bring Mortarion on from outflank and then bring on Death Shroud and Deep Strike them next to him and already be way up on your opponent's deployment zone if they didn't, advance down the board. I think that's good. The problem is I only have 3 painted Death Shroud and I would want to bring 5, and until then it's not worth it for me, on top of the fact that I think they're too expensive even though they're pretty handy. And so those are my thoughts on why I have not found a list yet that really works well with Mortarion. I know Don Huson, wants to do the... Mortarion with Poxmongers, Demon Engines, and then Summon Epidemias. I think that has value. I don't know if that's good enough to beat like a million OBSEC troops flooding the middle of the board, because that list, other Mortarion, doesn't cut through troops very quickly. But I can't try it either way because I don't have those Defilers painted. So let me see what other questions here. Yeah, Shane, the Word Bearer Sorcerer, I actually talked about that a lot, in my last video. I mentioned that, I know that recently on, like, Knights of the Game Table or Tabletop Titans or one of those, they made a big deal about it. I mentioned that a couple weeks ago on my episode 8, when I talked about Chaos Space Marines and really liking the idea of bringing in a Word Bearer's Terminator Sorcerer with the Relic. Ariman, the thing is, Games Workshop has really screwed up, in my opinion, on giving Space Marines so many different sniper units that are so... I think Eliminators and stuff are just too good. You shouldn't be able to do D3 wounds with one shot on a sniper, D3 damage at a time, and on top of the mortal wounds, on top of the other stuff. I think that's garbage. And then on top of that, of course, I think Assassins are ridiculously good. Vindicators are really good. And then on top of that, they just had to give AdMech, the snipers that also can do the extra damage, and they're really cheap. So you have all these troops that are snipers for AdMech, that people bring like 2, 3, 4 squads and just shoot whatever characters you have. And for some stupid reason, probably because the Death Guard Codex came out, the Thousand Suns Codex came out so early, they just don't have anything that can really absorb the bullets. They can do it. They have a historic invention of melee now from Psychic Awakening, but it's just so The stupid thing is, too, you've got these snipers that ignore invulnerable saves, which, if they didn't, at least you'd say, okay, you have to mostly rely on the mortal wounds, but they also have snipers that ignore invulnerable saves, and so you have to 3-up invulnerable save on Ahriman or something. It doesn't really help you. And ignores, of course, everybody has ignore cover on top of that for some reason, and so I love Ahriman, but he will just die to people spamming Space Marine snipers and AdMech snipers, which is very common in my area, and so I love Ahriman. It's just, with Games Workshop giving me no way to really protect him, it's just very difficult to take him. And he's so tall with his staff, and then you put him on a disc, and he's even taller. I think it would be better now, because the runes and things that are obscuring are infinite height, so it makes it easier to block him. But, it's still a big gamble. You could outflank him, too. I mean, technically, I think if you leave him on foot, you could pay 1 command point to deep strike him with webway infiltration, so that's something to consider. I will keep an eye on Ahriman. It's just, until they finally do something about the AdMech and Space Marine snipers, it's very hard to justify taking him. Lucas Verland asked, what do you think of Death Guard lists with lots of Plague Marines? How would you make a list like that work? I see a lot of people flipping out about how great Death Guard are, and usually they're focused on Plague Marines, which is funny because most people who actually play Death Guard, still think that Plague Marines are pretty bad because they are still overpriced. I mean, you compare a Plague Marine at 18 points to an Intercessor at 20 points, it's embarrassing how much better costed the Intercessor is. So I think right now the big question mark is, if you're going to do Plague Marines, do you want to do lots of squads of 10? Or do you want to do like one big squad of 20? I think the big squad of 20 is more reliable. The problem is, at that point, you basically have to take I think it's Mortarion's Chosen Sons Plague Company, because you're going to need to have the Plague Surgeon for reroll Disgustingly Resilient of 1 or 2. In case you don't, 1 for when you get into melee, but 2 in case you go second and the other person just tries to shoot your Plague Marines off the table, because otherwise they're just going to die before you can put Cloud of Flies up. And then you probably, if that happens, are so reliant on that big unit that you're going to spend 3 command points to give them all a 4-up Feel No Pain for that round. So that's one issue. The other issue is, if you're doing a big squad of 20 Plague Marines, what is going in front of those Plague Marines to block for them? You want to take Poxmongers, but then you're taking 2 Plague Companies. And you're paying the extra attachments, and you're paying for already the Plague Surgeon upgrade, and you're paying for, the Relic, the Furnace for the Poxmongers, and probably Arch Contaminator somewhere, and maybe you start giving Warlord trait to the Plague Surgeon to keep them alive. And the command points start draining pretty quickly. If you're bringing Defilers, you would want to give them Disgustingly Resilient, and so your points and your command points start draining quickly. Even though, if anybody gets close to that unit, they're fighting first with Foul Blight Spawn, that you can give them extra attacks, they probably have all these psychic power buffs on them, they'll kill anything in melee, they'll kill anything from 7 inches away, 17-ish, because you can move 5, spend a command point, throw those blight bombs from 12 inches away, do the mortal wounds if you have the character nearby, spend the stratagems, they all throw grenades, and they'll just, nuke anything that gets close to them. I think they can split the fire of those grenades, and you could probably nuke 2 knights with that many guys, within 12 inches. But then you're also like, well, mine are modeled with bolters, not knives, so do you want to spend a command points to make them shoot better with the bolters? Then do you want to spend more command points? Do you want to bring in, some sort of Chaos Space Marine or 1,000 Suns, because now you have a big investment in those 20 guys. Do you want to spend, don't you want to warp time them to move a second 5 inches? Don't you want to give them prescience, so in melee and shooting they're hitting on 2s? Things start adding up really fast, and then the other option is you bring them squads of 10, which might be good, or 9, and you have some characters and rhinos, which is a good idea. I think people who do the math, I've seen a couple people say, just 10 Plague Marines, if you use a couple stratagems and have the guy with the racks on him, Biologus Purifier, just 10 throwing grenades on average should kill a knight, so you don't need a bunch of one squad of 20, you can have a bunch of squads of 10. And then pick who does it. I think that might have some value. I'm waiting to see what lists emerge that really make that work. A lot of people say just do it with a drill. You know, the Forge World Termite drill. Well, I don't have one, and I hate just relying on Forge World to make Death Guard work. So I'm still waiting to see where the real value is. And I've thought of putting 9 Plague Marines in a Rhino with like a Foul Blight Spawn or the guy with the racks. You know, that is good. But I only own one of the Purifiers. And the other thing is, you know, if I'm taking that many guys to go take an objective, why don't I just take Spawn? And, you know, they're 115 points each. 150 points one command point, and they're pretty good at going and taking objectives. And they don't need any more stratagems after that. I'm not going to spend any more stratagems on them to make them good. You know, or I could just take like 2 or 3 squads of 5 Spawn. And so it's really hard for me to justify it. And then, you know, if you start spreading all over the objectives with these different 10-man squads, then they're not in range of, you know, your characters are giving reroll ones to hit. And so I think Games Workshop tried really hard to make Plague Marines good, but giving them a bunch of expensive stratagems to make them do anything, and then you still make them expensive at 18 points each, and then they're still slow. That's a really weird way to fix that problem. And I'm sure there's a way to make it work. And I had someone at the tournament tell me, yeah, this guy brought 20 Plague Marines. My brother, we practiced, and you know, he tabled my Space Marine army with those grenades. And so maybe I just need to try it myself. You know, those are some things where I do have really everything painted, and so I can do it. I'm just not sure what that list would be right now. Yeah, so feel free to keep asking questions, guys, but I'm going to go into what I was going to bring up, which is kind of some lessons learned from the having played at a 9th edition tournament, just to kind of help round out the episode. We've been going for a while, and thank you all for watching. I'm really glad that people came, and most people aren't even leaving. So if you missed the earlier parts of the episode, once this live stream ends, YouTube takes, you know, anywhere from 10 to 48 hours to do the encoding on its side for the HD, and then it'll disappear for a day or two off my YouTube page, and then it'll go right back on and be available for viewing anytime you want. And at the beginning, I went through my list, I scrolled through it, I have pictures of all the games I played at this tournament, so go back and watch the whole episode. And by the way, please hit me up with a subscribe if you like all the free content and the discussion of Chaos Thoughts, and follow me on Facebook and Instagram if you haven't yet, at Hexfleet Virulus, up there in the corner. But general thoughts about 9th edition. I was really surprised how quickly the armies had to rush towards each other. I was surprised at how shooty armies still are, even armies that aren't normally just thought of as shooty. On the smaller board, you know, they could still kill Poxwalkers really fast. I was surprised that, you know, there's still quite a lot of limits with the strategic reserve outflank with Magnus or whatever else about can't come in within 9, have to be within 6 inches fully of the table edge. With Magnus, it's a little tough because his wings, you have to maybe face him backwards. So those are things that all surprised me. I was surprised at how fast those 5 turns went, and I realized how much the person who is now winning and has more stuff left on the table, that 6th turn is where they would really run up the scoreboard or take the win. You know, and I pretty much tabled or came close to tabling all 3 of my opponents. And if I had one more round, I maybe would have just about tabled all of them. But I still lost my first game because I did not score enough primary in the early few turns against Rich Kilton. So that was a big surprise to me, and it really just again underscores the urgency of. You could still, I think, pick up a decent amount of secondaries later on for some of the secondaries, but you know, the other half of the secondaries, you still need to start grabbing them from the first or second turn. There's a good amount of secondaries where you really only can get 3 a turn, and so you need to be getting them all 5 turns. And the primary, you know, you need to be getting them all 5 turns, unless you are very confident that in turns 3, 4, and 5, you're going to dunk your opponents really hard to the point where you're always holding more objectives. But otherwise, you need to at least be holding 2 objectives. But again, the nice thing I mentioned earlier is if you just bring like 2 squads of 9 nerdlings or something, you can come up with a list where all you try to do is hold 2 objectives, and then it doesn't really matter how many objectives are on the table. You're going to get a lot of primaries as long as you are always holding 2 objectives, and maybe you have some like throwaway cultists in your backfield, and they can help you hold 2 objectives too. And so that's just something to consider. I'm surprised how hard it is to pick secondaries, and how hard it is to score points on the secondaries. One thing that is kind of silly that I hope they change is that if you're playing like Tower Necrons where you don't have any psychic powers, or if you just run a list without any psychers, you can double up Aboard the Witch and Assassinate, and then every kill Magnus or kill a Demon Prince or kill Typhus, it's 6 points because you're scoring for the character and for the fact you killed a psyker. And if you have greater demons, this is just another reason demons suck into addition, and why I'm so upset with Games Workshop shitting all over that army constantly, is then you can also triple it up with the one about killing monsters, and so each greater demon you kill is 8 points. And now that they FAQ'd it, and you can't do the Exalted more than once, and there's some questions about who can even take the Exalted relics, can you use the stratagem for them or not. It's just like, and then the Great Unclean one is slow, and it can't even hide because it's 18 or more wounds, and it's like, okay, here's an army of a bunch of probably overpriced big models that we really limited their stratagems, and you can't do certain things if they're mixed attachments, which now detachments cost command point. And by the way, every one of those that does die to the ridiculous shooting that's still in the edition is 8 secondaries. And so to me, the troops now suck except for arguably Daemonettes, and then they made the greater demons really suck, and so I think it's really hard to make demons work unless you just run a list with like 6 or 8 of them and just throw them somehow at your opponent. And so there's some weird things about secondaries that are really punishing to some Chaos armies, and it's good to be aware of that when building your lists. Alright, well, this has been going on for a while. I'll think if I have any more thoughts and maybe talk about it in my next episode. I don't know what the next episode is going to be about. I'm always taking suggestions on what you want me to talk about in the comments to the videos, or you can post on my Facebook page and a comment to one of my posts there, or even on Instagram. But just let me know what you'd like to see in upcoming episodes of Warp Surge Radio. I thought this would be really interesting since most people aren't getting to play tournaments at the moment with COVID and everything, and with the game having changed so dramatically. So I tried a wacky kind of new list that I brainstormed really hard, and it ended up doing really well. But I think there's much better lists out there, and it's probably not strong enough to stand up to super strong lists from other armies. And so I'd like to come up with something better. I know I could come up with something much better if I had certain models painted, but I'm going to go back to the drawing board and think what I can bring with the models that I already have painted. And so thank you guys so much for watching. This is by far the most people I've had on for a consistent long stretch during one of the videos, and so I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who watched the video. Please subscribe, follow me on Facebook, and encourage your friends to watch the videos and encourage them to subscribe. So and feel free to comment. I go back to the videos, I get alerts, and so even if you comment on this video weeks after it first went live, I will probably come back and chat and discuss lists with you. So thank you all for watching. Appreciate you guys hanging out for so long. It was fun talking about the tournament with you, and hope you all have a great night.